They offered him their entire month's salary if he could fix what their million-dollar computers couldn't, and the smirks on their faces said they thought their money was safe. The morning sun cut through the massive hangar doors like a spotlight, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air above the concrete floor. The smell hit you first, that intoxicating mixture of aviation fuel, machine oil, and metal that every aircraft enthusiast knows by heart. But there was something else too, something older. The scent of history itself seemed to cling to the aluminum skin of the B-17 flying fortress that dominated the center of the restoration facility. Frank Morrison stood at the entrance, his worn canvas tool bag hanging from one weathered hand. He was 82 years old, though he'd stopped telling people his age years ago, not because he was ashamed of it, but because the number seemed to be all anyone heard. His flannel shirt had seen better decades, patched at the elbows with fabric that didn't quite match. His work boots were scuffed leather, the kind you couldn't buy anymore because they were made to last a lifetime, and he'd already gotten his money's worth. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, bore the permanent stains of a man who'd spent 7 decades making things work. The hangar bustled with activity. Young men in crisp polo shirts emblazoned with heritage aviation restoration moved with the confident swagger of people who'd never been told they couldn't do something. Their tools gleamed, chrome and composite materials, organized in rolling toolboxes that probably cost more than Frank's first car. Laptops sat open on workbenches, displaying diagnostic readouts and CAD drawings. Everything was modern, efficient, expensive. Frank took a step inside, his boots making a soft shuffling sound on the polished concrete. "Can I help you, sir?" The voice came from a young man, maybe 30, with perfectly styled hair and a tablet tucked under his arm. The "sir" sounded polite enough, but there was something underneath it. That tone people use when they're already planning how to get rid of you. "I'm here about the mechanic position," Frank said, his voice gravelly from decades of shouting over engine noise. "Saw your posting at the VA hall." The young man's eyebrows rose slightly. He glanced over his shoulder at 2 colleagues who'd stopped their conversation to watch. One of them, a tall guy with designer glasses and an expensive watch, didn't even try to hide his smirk. "Ah, yes. Well, Mr. Morrison." "Frank Morrison. Mr. Morrison, I'm Derek Hastings, Facility Director." He extended his hand, and Frank shook it. Derek's grip was firm but brief, like he was checking off a box on a to-do list. "I appreciate you coming down, but I think there might have been some confusion. When we posted for experienced aircraft mechanics, we were really looking for someone with current certifications in modern restoration techniques. You know, CAD software proficiency, composite materials, contemporary FAA protocols." Frank nodded slowly. "That bird there," he gestured toward the B-17 with his chin, "is a 1944 Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress. She's got 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines, 18 cylinders each, 900 horsepower when she's running right. The way she's sitting now, port inner engine's got a timing issue. Can hear it from here even without her running. That tick in the auxiliary generator means somebody's been trying to force modern voltage regulators into her, and it's not taking." Derek's expression shifted slightly, but the condescension didn't leave his eyes. That's actually pretty good for someone just walking in off the street. Did you read about her online?" Behind him, the tall guy with the glasses, his name tag read Cameron, let out a short laugh. "Dude probably memorized the Wikipedia page on the drive over." "I didn't drive," Frank said quietly. "Took the bus. Can't afford to keep a car anymore." The words hung in the air, and Frank immediately regretted them. He saw it in their faces, the confirmation of what they'd already assumed. Old, broke, desperate, past his prime. "Look, Mr. Morrison," Derek said, his voice taking on that syrupy quality people use when they're trying to let you down easy. "I'm sure you're very passionate about aviation, and we really do appreciate veterans and their service. But this is a $50 million restoration project. We've got corporate sponsors, airshow commitments, a documentary crew coming next month. We need people who are up to date with current industry standards, people who can, handle the physical demands of the work. I can handle the work, Frank said. But even as the words left his mouth, he heard how they sounded, defensive, weak, the plea of a man who knew he was already beaten. Cameron stepped closer, and Frank caught a whiff of expensive cologne. Here's the thing, Pops. No offense, but when's the last time you actually worked on an aircraft? These birds aren't flying anymore because guys from your generation stopped being able to climb up on the wings. It's a young man's game now. We've got certifications from MIT, from Caltech. We've got computer modeling that can predict metal fatigue down to the micrometer. What have you got? A bag of old wrenches and stories about the good old days? Frank felt the familiar burn in his chest. 70 years ago, he would have responded differently, would have had the energy to argue, to prove himself. Now he just felt tired. Tired and small. Those aren't just wrenches, he said quietly, almost to himself. I'm sure they're very special to you, Derek said, glancing at his watch. Tell you what, why don't you leave your contact information with Jessica at the front desk? If something opens up that might be more suitable for someone with your background, we'll definitely give you a call. They wouldn't call. Frank had heard this speech before at 5 other places over the past 3 months. Ever since the small repair shop where he'd worked for 20 years had closed down, replaced by a chain auto parts store. He was turning to leave when a commotion erupted from the far end of the hangar. A group of mechanics had gathered around a workbench, their voices rising in frustration. That's impossible. The readout says the timing is perfect. Well, obviously the readout is wrong. Maybe the sensor's bad. We've replaced the sensor 3 times. Derek's jaw tightened. He strode toward the group, Cameron following. Frank, forgotten, drifted along behind them, drawn by decades of instinct toward the sound of a problem that needed solving. The mechanics had surrounded one of the B-17's massive propeller assemblies, which had been removed and mounted on a test stand. Computer cables snaked from diagnostic ports, feeding data to a laptop where lines of code scrolled past. A younger woman in coveralls, her hands pristine despite the work gloves she wore, was shaking her head at the screen. "I don't understand it," she said, frustration sharp in her voice. "According to everything we know, according to the manual, according to the diagnostics, this propeller governor should be functioning perfectly. But every time we run it up, the pitch control goes haywire at 1200 RPM. It's like the blade angles just lose their minds. Could it be the oil pressure?" someone suggested. "Oil pressure is exactly where it should be. We've checked it 20 times. Oh, Derek ran his hand through his hair, leaving it slightly disheveled for the first time since Frank had arrived. "This is unacceptable. We've got the press event in 2 weeks. The plane needs to be airworthy for a flyover at the Veterans Day ceremony. The governor on the starboard outer engine is the last critical component we need to certify, and we can't even figure out what's wrong with it." Have we considered replacing the entire assembly?" Cameron asked. "With what? Original B-17 propeller governors aren't exactly sitting on a shelf at Home Depot. The one we've got is original wartime production. Supposedly it was overhauled in 2010, but it doesn't work," the woman in coveralls finished. Frank had edged close enough now to see the propeller hub assembly on the test stand. His eyes tracked the hydraulic lines, the pitch control linkage, the governor housing. Without thinking, his hand had moved to his chest, fingers touching the spot where, beneath his shirt, an old scar ran from his collarbone to his sternum. A gift from a piece of shrapnel over the Ploiesti oil fields in 1943. "Excuse me," he said softly. No one turned. "Excuse me," he repeated slightly louder. Derek glanced back, annoyed. "Mr. Morrison, I thought you were leaving." "The counterweights," Frank said. "What?" "In the governor. The counterweights. You're getting oscillation at 1200 RPM because that's where the harmonic frequency of the counterweight springs intersects with the natural frequency of the blade loading. Happens when the springs have been replaced with modern alloy springs that have a different spring constant than the original steel. The math works on paper, but the physics don't. The group had gone silent. They were all staring at him now, really seeing him for the first time. Cameron's laugh was harsh. Springs? You think we haven't considered the springs? We use the exact specifications from a manual written by engineers who never flew in these birds. Frank interrupted, his voice still quiet, but with an edge now, sharp as a propeller tip. I'm telling you, if you replace those springs with anything made after 1950, you're fighting a losing battle. The original springs were made from high-carbon steel with a specific heat treatment process that nobody uses anymore. They had exactly the right give at exactly the right frequency. Change that, and you get flutter. Flutter becomes oscillation. Oscillation tears the governor apart from the inside. The woman in coveralls frowned, her irritation shifting to curiosity. How would you even know if the springs had been replaced? Did you rebuild it yourself? No, it came from a restoration shop in California. Then they replaced them. Everybody does. Original springs look worn, pitted. People think they're bad because they don't look pretty. So they swap them out for new ones that look better but perform worse. Frank took a step closer to the test stand. You want to fix it? You need springs with the original spring constant, or you need to add damping mass to the counterweights to shift the harmonic frequency away from your operating range. Derek's expression had changed. The condescension was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, uncertainty. And I suppose you just happen to have original springs in that antique tool bag of yours. Cameron's sarcasm was thick, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Frank shook his head. No, but I can make the damping weights. Take me about 2 hours with a lathe and some brass stock. Make them? Just make them? The woman in coveralls crossed her arms. Based on what calculations? Based on 70 years of making these birds fly when there wasn't time for calculations. Based on doing it in the dark, in the cold, with bombs falling and crews depending on getting airborne before dawn. Based on learning from old chiefs who knew these engines like they knew their own heartbeats. Frank's voice had dropped even lower, but somehow it carried through the hangar. I don't need to calculate the harmonic frequency. I can hear it. You can hear it, Cameron repeated flatly. The engine isn't even running. Don't need it running. I can see it in how the blades sit. Can see it in the wear pattern on the pivot points. Can see it in the sheen on the hydraulic actuator housing. These birds talk if you know how to listen. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence in the hangar felt heavy, broken only by the distant sound of compressed air tools from another part of the facility. Finally, Derek shook his head slowly. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your confidence, but we're not going to hand over a critical component of a $50 million aircraft to someone we just met, someone without current certifications, someone who... He paused, clearly trying to find diplomatic words. Someone who we can't verify. You can't verify me. Frank said it as a statement, not a question. Exactly. For all we know, and again, no offense intended, you could have Alzheimer's or dementia. You could be having delusions about your past experience. We'd be liable if I fixed your problem. Frank smiled, but there was no humor in it. You'd be liable if the crazy old man actually knew what he was talking about. That's not what I... It's exactly what you meant. Frank hefted his tool bag, feeling the familiar weight of it. Inside were tools that had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1942, tools that had kept flying fortresses in the air when younger men were sure the birds were done, tools that carried the ghost memory of emergency repairs at dawn, of improvised fixes over enemy territory, of making the impossible work because the alternative was unthinkable. But these people didn't want to know about that. They wanted certifications and CAD drawings and diagnostic readouts that told them they were right. Good luck with your propeller, Frank said, turning toward the hangar doors. Hope you figure it out before your press event. He'd made it about 10 steps when Cameron's voice rang out behind him. Hey, old-timer. Frank stopped, but didn't turn around. Just so we're clear, if we can't get this figured out, it's not because you were right. It's because this is complex modern restoration work that requires expertise you don't have. The world's moved on from whatever you think you remember. Maybe it's time you did too. Frank stood there for another heartbeat, his shadow stretching long across the polished concrete floor. Then he continued walking, his boots making that same soft shuffling sound, getting quieter with each step. Behind him, Derek's voice rose again, back to giving orders. All right, let's try recalibrating the sensors one more time. There has to be something we're missing. The morning sun was brighter now as Frank emerged from the hangar, and he had to squint against it. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. His knees ached with each step. His tool bag felt heavier than it had in years. In his mind, he could still hear them. Not the voices of Derek and Cameron and the others, but different voices. Younger versions of himself and men who'd been dead for 70 years. Voices shouting over engine roar, over wind, over fear. Voices calling out timing adjustments while fighters dove from above and flak burst below. Voices thanking him for keeping them alive. One more mission, one more night, one more impossible dawn. But those voices were ghosts now, and ghosts, Frank had learned, weren't much use in the modern world. He reached the bus stop and set down his tool bag, easing himself onto the metal bench. A digital display announced the next bus would arrive in 11 minutes. Frank Morrison had 11 minutes to sit and remember being someone who mattered. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that back in that hangar, something was about to go very, very wrong. And when it did, everything those young mechanics thought they knew about expertise, about respect, about the value of experience, was about to get shattered like a propeller blade hitting the sound barrier. 3 days can feel like a lifetime when you're waiting for a phone call that you know will never come. Frank Morrison had stopped checking his ancient flip phone by the 2nd day. By the 3rd day, he'd almost convinced himself he didn't care anymore. Almost. It was just past 7 in the morning when the phone rang, shattering the silence of his small apartment. Frank was at his kitchen table, nursing his 2nd cup of instant coffee, the cheap kind that tasted like burnt rubber but cost $1 less than the decent stuff. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. Not from age, though that didn't help. From something else, something that felt uncomfortably close to hope. "Hello? Mr. Morrison?" The voice was tight, stressed. It took Frank a moment to place it. Derek Hastings, the facility director who dismissed him 3 days ago. "Speaking. Mr. Morrison, this is Derek Hastings from Heritage Aviation Restoration. We met earlier this week." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of someone swallowing their pride with great difficulty. "We have a situation here, a serious situation, and I'm calling to ask if you'd be willing to come back to the facility." Frank said nothing, just waited. "The thing is," Derek's voice dropped lower, "we took your advice about the counterweights, and you were right. The springs had been replaced. We fabricated damping weights, and the governor works perfectly now." "That's good," Frank said carefully. "Yes, but that's not why I'm calling." Derek took a breath. "We installed the governor yesterday. This morning we fired her up for a full systems check, and the starboard inner engine seized, completely locked up. The whole engine's destroyed." Frank closed his eyes. He could picture it exactly. The sound it would have made, that terrible grinding shriek of parts that were never meant to touch suddenly meeting with the full force of 900 horsepower behind them. "We're dead in the water," Derek continued, desperation clear in his voice. "The Veterans Day flyover is in 11 days. We have sponsors threatening to pull funding. We have veterans from across the country planning to attend because we promised them they'd see a B-17 fly. And we have an engine that cannot be rebuilt in time. Why are you calling me? Because Sarah asked around. Your name came up. Frank Morrison, flight engineer with the 381st Bomb Group, 37 missions over Europe, Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Air Medals, Purple Heart. After the war, worked for Boeing, then ran your own business for 40 years. Derek's voice had changed entirely. The condescension was gone, replaced by shame. "You weren't just some mechanic. You're a legend who walked into my hangar, and I treated you like a confused old man." Frank felt his throat tighten. He hadn't heard those words spoken aloud in years. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Mr. Morrison, I'm begging you to come look at this engine. I know I don't deserve your help after how we treated you, but those veterans who are planning to attend that ceremony, they deserve to see that bird fly." Frank looked around his small apartment, at the faded photographs on the wall, young men in leather jackets, standing in front of aircraft that most of them would never return from. At the shadow box holding his medals, dusty from years of neglect. "I'll need to see the engine," he said finally. "I'll send a car." The black SUV that picked up Frank was newer than anything he'd ever ridden in. When they arrived at the hangar, Derek was waiting outside, along with Sarah and two other mechanics. Cameron, the tall guy with the expensive watch, was notably absent. "Mr. Morrison." Derek extended his hand, and this time the grip was different, respectful. "Thank you for coming." "Haven't fixed anything yet," Frank said. Sarah stepped forward. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying or hadn't slept. "Mr. Morrison, I'm the one who pushed to test your theory. I'm also the one supervising when the engine seized. This is my fault." "Show me the engine," Frank interrupted, not unkindly. They led him into the hangar. The B-17 sat in the center like a massive silver bird with clipped wings. Scaffolding surrounded the starboard side, where panels had been removed to expose the wounded engine. Even from a distance, Frank could smell it, that acrid scent of overheated metal and destroyed bearings. A crowd had gathered. Word had apparently spread. Frank recognized some faces from his first visit. All of them watched him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Frank approached the aircraft slowly. The starboard inner engine looked intact from the outside, but he knew that meant nothing. The real damage was inside, where precision tolerances had been violated and parts had welded themselves together in a death grip of friction and heat. He set down his tool bag and pulled out a flashlight. Not an LED like everyone else used, an old steel maglite with an incandescent bulb that threw warm yellow light. "Talk me through what happened," he said. Sarah consulted a clipboard. "We completed installation at 1600 hours yesterday. This morning at 0630, we started the run-up. Port engines fired normally. Starboard outer came up smooth. Starboard inner fired normally, but at 3 minutes, while advancing to cruise power, we heard the noise. We immediately cut all engines, but the damage was done." Frank played the flashlight beam across the cylinder heads, the pushrod housings, the accessory section. "Oil pressure?" "Normal throughout." "Oil temperature?" "Also normal." Everything was reading exactly as it should. "Until it wasn't," Frank murmured. He shifted position, his knees protesting, and aimed the light deeper. Something caught his eye, a subtle discoloration on one of the oil return lines. "Get me a ladder," he said, "and I need someone young and skinny with an inspection mirror." A young mechanic named Tommy volunteered. Frank directed him like a surgeon, calling out exactly where to position the mirror, what angle to hold the light. "Tell me what you see on the number 5-cylinder oil return line, about 3 inches above the case junction." Tommy contorted himself into the narrow space. "There's something weird here. The line looks almost like it's collapsed from the inside." "Exactly," Frank said. "When was the last time this engine was completely overhauled?" Sarah flipped through papers. "Full overhaul in 2008, 17 years ago. And since then, annual inspections, minor repairs, but no major work." Frank straightened up slowly. He looked around at the assembled faces, young, educated, certified professionals trained with the latest technology. Good people who knew their manuals and regulations, but they didn't know the sound an engine made when it was dying from the inside out. "Your oil return line has a restriction," Frank said. "Internal buildup, probably carbon deposits. Happens over years, especially if the engine sits between runs. Usually it's not a problem because there's enough flow, But when you run up to cruise power, especially after sitting cold, oil demand increases. More demand meets restricted flow. Some cylinders start running oil-starved. Not enough to trigger warnings because the system overall looks good. But that one cylinder, that one bearing, it's running dry. And when metal touches metal at 3,000 RPM, he made a grinding gesture. The diagnostic computer should have caught that, one of the mechanics objected. You have sensors monitoring oil flow at inlet points, Frank corrected. But if the restriction is in the return line, your sensors never see the problem. The oil goes in fine. It just can't get back out fast enough. Sarah broke the silence. If you're right, we need to remove the engine, disassemble it completely. No time for that, Frank said flatly. But the damage, question, is whether it's catastrophic or just catastrophic looking. If the seizure was quick enough, if your engineer's reflexes were good, there's a chance the damage is limited to 1, maybe 2 cylinders. Rest might be salvageable. Might be, Derek repeated. Only one way to find out. We pull the affected cylinders, inspect them. If the damage is too deep, we replace the cylinders. If the connecting rods are bent, we replace those. Then we flush every oil line, replace filters, and clean that return line. How long? To know if it's possible, 4 hours. To do the repairs if we're lucky, 3 days, maybe 4. We have 11 days until the flyover. Then you've got time to spare, Frank said, assuming you've got the parts. We have a warehouse full, Derek said, but what you're proposing is a massive gamble. If we tear into this and discover it's too far gone, we've wasted days we could have spent on a replacement engine. That's true, Frank acknowledged. So why should we trust your assessment? Frank looked up at the B-17, at the nose art, a cartoon woman riding a bomb, with Memphis Belle Jr. scripted underneath. 1944, he said quietly. Ridgewell, England. 381st Bomb Group. We had a bird called the Iron Maiden. She took flak over Schweinfurt that tore apart her number 2 engine. Everyone said she needed a full swap, and we didn't have a spare. But we had a mission in 3 days. He paused, remembering. The smell of English rain, the feel of cold metal under his hands, the weight of knowing that if he got it wrong, 10 men would die. I spent 72 hours inside that engine, pulled 6 cylinders, replaced bearings, retimed the valve train by hand. My crew chief said I was crazy, but on day 3, when I hit the starter, that engine sang. She flew 15 more missions, brought her crew home every single time. The hangar had gone completely silent. I can't promise you this engine will fly, Frank continued. But I can promise you that I know these birds better than I know my own heartbeat. I learned about them when failure meant death, and success meant those boys got to see their families again. He turned to Derek. The question is whether you're willing to bet on experience over technology, on knowledge that came from necessity rather than certification. Derek looked at Sarah. Your call. Your chief of maintenance. Sarah's eyes moved from Derek to Frank to the wounded engine. Frank could see the calculation, the weight of responsibility, the fear of failure, the terrible burden of making a decision that dozens of veterans were counting on. Do it, she said finally. Mr. Morrison, the engine is yours. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Frank picked up his tool bag. I need 6 mechanics, a cylinder removal kit, every overhaul manual for the R1820, and all the coffee in the building. Done, Derek said. Anything else? I need everyone else back to work. This isn't a spectator sport. Either trust me or don't, but I can't fix an engine with 40 people waiting for me to fail. Derek raised his voice. Back to your stations. Sarah, assemble your team. As the hangar cleared, Sarah gathered 6 mechanics, including Tommy and a grizzled guy named Pete, who looked to be in his 50s. Frank surveyed them. Can any of you work without diagnostic computers? Feel when a bolt is properly torqued instead of trusting a readout? Hear when an engine is telling you something's wrong before the sensors pick it up? Pete spoke up. Used to work on crop dusters in the 70s, learned on birds that didn't have computers. I can work old school. That's exactly what I need, Frank said. I'll teach the rest as we go. Now let's get to work. They set up work lights around the engine and laid out tools in a specific order, the order Frank had learned 80 years ago. We start by pulling cylinders 3 and 4, he instructed. Tommy, you're my eyes inside. Pete, you're on measurements. Sarah, you coordinate parts and documentation. Frank opened his tool bag and pulled out a wrench. Not a modern torque wrench with digital readout. A simple open-end wrench, the steel worn smooth from decades of use. The same wrench he'd used on the Iron Maiden in 1944. He positioned it on the first cylinder hold-down nut and began to apply pressure. And as the afternoon sun streamed through the hangar windows, as the smell of oil and metal and possibility filled the air, Frank Morrison began to do what he'd done better than anyone else for 7 decades. He began to make the impossible work. But as his hands moved with the muscle memory of a lifetime, he had no idea that what they were about to discover inside that engine would test not just his mechanical skill, but everything he thought he knew about these birds he'd loved for so long. And when they pulled that first cylinder, well, that's when things got interesting. The first cylinder came off easier than Frank expected, which immediately made him suspicious. In his experience, when something should be hard but wasn't, it usually meant you were about to discover why it should have been impossible. Set it down gently, he instructed Tommy, who was cradling the massive cylinder assembly like it was made of glass. Pete, get the measuring tools. Sarah, I need light. Lots of light. They positioned work lamps around the opened engine, creating a pool of brightness that seemed to push back the shadows of the hangar itself. Frank pulled on a pair of worn leather gloves, not for protection, but because the oil and grime would make his arthritic fingers slip. The gloves were older than most of the people in the room, darkened by decades of use, soft as butter. He leaned in close to the exposed cylinder barrel, his face inches from the metal. The younger mechanics watched, confused. They were used to borescopes and digital imaging, not this intimate, almost reverent inspection. "What do you smell?" Frank asked suddenly. The question caught everyone off guard. Tommy looked at Sarah, who looked at Pete, who finally shrugged and leaned in to sniff. "Oil?" Pete offered. "Burned metal? I don't know, what am I supposed to smell?" "Wrong question," Frank said, still examining the cylinder walls. "Right question is, what don't you smell?" He straightened up, his knees popping audibly. "You don't smell aluminum. When these cylinders seize badly, really seize, the aluminum pistons start to break down. Smells like hot pennies mixed with something sweet and chemical. Makes your nose itch. But this," he gestured at the cylinder, "this smells like regular overheating. Hot, yes. Damaged, yes, but not catastrophic." He ran his finger along the inside of the cylinder barrel, feeling textures invisible to the eye. His fingers paused, moved back, pressed gently against a spot about halfway down. "Here," he said. "Tommy, get the mirror in here. Pete, I need the depth gauge." For the next 20 minutes, they measured and documented. The scoring on the cylinder walls was bad, deep scratches where the piston had dragged metal against metal, but it was localized, concentrated in one area, like a wound that hadn't spread. "It's savable," Frank announced finally. "Barely. We'll need to hone it, probably oversized pistons, new rings definitely, but the barrel itself isn't cracked. The metallurgy is still sound." "How can you tell?" Sarah asked, genuine curiosity replacing her earlier stress. Frank tapped the cylinder with his knuckle. It rang with a clear, bell-like tone. "Hear that? That's solid metal, properly tempered, no internal fractures. Cracked cylinder sounds different, duller, like tapping a clay pot instead of a bell. Your ears can tell you things that X-rays miss if you know how to listen." They pulled the second cylinder, and this one told a different story. The moment it came free, Frank knew. The weight was wrong, too light by maybe half a pound, and when he looked inside, his suspicions were confirmed. "Son of a bitch," Pete breathed, staring into the cylinder. The interior looked like a war zone. Not just scoring, but actual chunks of metal missing from the cylinder walls. The piston, when they extracted it, was partially melted, the aluminum warped and bubbled like candle wax. "This is the one that seized," Frank said quietly. "This is where it all went wrong." One of the younger mechanics, a kid named Jason, who'd been mostly silent until now, spoke up. "So we replace it, right? We've got spare cylinders in the warehouse." "Maybe," Frank said, but his tone suggested complications. "Maybe." Sarah's voice had that edge of stress creeping back in. "Mr. Morrison, either we can replace it or we can't." "We can replace the cylinder," Frank clarified. "Question is whether the connecting rod is bent, whether the crankshaft is scored, whether the cam lobes are damaged. This cylinder didn't just fail, it failed violently. When that much metal comes apart at operating RPM, it sends shrapnel through the whole lower end. Could be fine, could be a disaster." "Only one way to find out," Pete said, echoing Frank's earlier words. Frank nodded. "Only one way. We go deeper." The next 4 hours were a masterclass in mechanical archaeology. Frank had them remove the accessory case, exposing the engine's guts, the spinning, grinding, precisely timed mechanical ballet that turned fuel and air into power. Each part they removed, Frank inspected with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. His hands moved constantly, touching, feeling, testing. Where the younger mechanics relied on measurements and specifications, Frank seemed to diagnose by touch, alone. A bearing that should have been replaced, a gear with micro-fractures invisible to the naked eye, an oil passage that had been incorrectly cleaned during the last overhaul, leaving debris that had been slowly working its way through the system for years. "How are you seeing these things?" Sarah finally asked, frustration and awe mixing in her voice. "We have diagnostic equipment that cost $500,000, and you're finding problems by feel?" Frank paused, a connecting rod in his hands, his fingers tracing the subtle curve of the bearing surface. "Your equipment tells you what's wrong right now," he said. "My hands tell me what's going to be wrong next week, next month, next year. There's a difference between reading numbers and understanding metal." He held up the connecting rod, angling it so the light caught the bearing surface. To the untrained eye it looked fine, smooth, properly lubricated within specifications, but Frank's fingers had found something else. "See here?" He pointed to a spot that looked identical to the rest of the surface. "Metal fatigue, not enough to show up on measurements yet, but it's there. The crystalline structure is starting to break down. You can feel it. The metal's just slightly softer than it should be, slightly warmer to the touch, even at room temperature. Means the molecules are moving more than they should be, which means they're coming apart." "That's impossible," Jason said. "You can't feel molecular structure." "Can't you?" Frank's eyes had a distant look, like he was somewhere else. "Flew 37 missions. Every single one. I'd do a pre-flight check with my hands, run them over every critical surface, every bolt, every fuel line. Crew thought I was superstitious, doing some kind of ritual for luck. But I was reading the aircraft, feeling for the tiny changes that meant something was about to fail. And you know what? We never had a mechanical failure in combat, not once. Lost plenty of birds to flak and fighters, but never to bad maintenance." The hangar had gone quiet, except for the sound of Frank's voice and the distant hum of activity from other parts of the facility. "The metal talks to you if you listen," he continued, still holding the connecting rod. "It tells you when it's happy, when it's stressed, when it's dying. Most people don't want to learn that language anymore. Easier to trust a computer readout, faster, more efficient. But computers don't feel fatigue. They don't sense wrongness. They just report numbers, and numbers don't know how to be afraid." He set down the connecting rod carefully. "This rod is still within spec. Your computer would say it's fine, but I'm telling you, it's got maybe 50 more flight hours before it fails. Maybe less. You put this back in the engine, you're gambling with people's lives." Sarah was making notes on her clipboard, her hand moving rapidly. "So we need a new connecting rod." "What else?" "What else?" Frank smiled, but there was no humor in it. What else is that we need to inspect every single rod, every bearing, every critical component, because if one rod is fatigued, others might be too. That overhaul in 2008, somebody cut corners, did the minimum to pass certification, looked good on paper, but they didn't put their hands on the metal, didn't listen to what it was saying. That's going to add days to the repair, one of the mechanics said. Rather add days to the repair than seconds to someone's funeral, Frank replied sharply. Then softer, sorry, but I've seen what happens when you rush. Seen birds go down because somebody was in a hurry, somebody trusted the paperwork instead of the parts. I won't do that. Not to this aircraft, not to whoever's going to fly her. Derek had appeared at some point during the inspection, standing at the edge of the work area. Now he stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, I need to ask, realistically, can we make the Veterans Day deadline? Frank straightened up, feeling every one of his 82 years in his back and knees. He looked at the partially disassembled engine, at the pile of parts that needed replacing, at the work that still lay ahead. Yes, he said finally. If we work smart and don't sleep much, yes, but I need full authority over this repair. No second-guessing, no committee decisions, no checking with the manual every 5 minutes. I tell you what needs to be done, you trust me to do it. Deal? Derek extended his hand. Deal. They shook, and Frank felt the weight of that agreement settle onto his shoulders. He'd made promises before, to crews, to commanders, to young men who trusted him to keep them alive. But that was a lifetime ago, when his hands were steady and his eyes were sharp and his body didn't ache with every movement. Now he was an old man, making a promise he wasn't entirely sure he could keep. All right, he said, turning back to the engine. Here's how this is going to work. Sarah, I need you to pull every connecting rod we've got in inventory. I'll inspect each one personally. Pete, you're going to learn how to feel for metal fatigue. Tommy, you're my arms and eyes in the tight spaces. Jason, you're on parts cleaning, and I mean really cleaning, not just running them through the sonic bath and calling it done. He paused, looking at each of them in turn. This is going to be hard work. Old-fashioned, hands-on, no shortcuts work. Some of you are going to think I'm crazy. Some of you are going to want to argue with my methods, but I'm asking you to trust me the way I'm trusting you. Can you do that? One by one, they nodded. Good. Then let's get to work. We've got an engine to rebuild and a promise to keep. As the sun began to set outside the hangar, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, Frank Morrison rolled up his sleeves and dove back into the guts of the Wright R1820 Cyclone engine. His hands moved with practiced precision, pulling apart decades of accumulated wear and neglect, finding the hidden problems that lurked beneath the surface. Around him, the younger mechanics watched and learned. They learned how to feel the subtle difference between good metal and failing metal. They learned how to hear the story an engine told through the pattern of its wear. They learned that sometimes the most sophisticated diagnostic tool was a pair of experienced hands and a mind that had seen everything go wrong and learned how to make it right. But they didn't learn everything. They didn't learn about the nightmares Frank still had, where he was 20 years old again and trying to fix an engine while fighters screamed down from above. They didn't learn about the men whose faces he still saw when he closed his eyes, men who'd trusted him to keep them flying, to keep them alive. They didn't learn that every bolt he tightened, every part he inspected, every decision he made was haunted by the memory of the ones he couldn't save. And they definitely didn't learn what Frank was about to discover in the engine's oil sump. Something that would explain not just why this engine had failed, but something far more disturbing about the restoration itself. Something that would make Frank question whether this aircraft should ever fly again. Chapter 4. The Hidden Truth. The oil sump came off just after midnight. Frank had sent most of the crew home hours ago. They needed rest, and exhausted mechanics made mistakes. But he'd stayed, along with Pete and Sarah, who'd both refused to leave. The hangar felt different at night, quieter. The sounds of their work echoed off the distant walls, and the pools of light from the work lamps created islands of brightness in an ocean of shadow. "Careful with it," Frank warned, as Pete helped him lower the heavy aluminum pan. "Don't want to spill whatever's inside until we can see it." They set the sump down on a clean work table, and Frank positioned a light directly overhead. The oil inside was dark, almost black, with the consistency of honey, normal for an engine of this age. But as Frank stirred it gently with a wooden dowel, never metal could scratch and contaminate, something caught the light. "What the hell is that?" Pete leaned closer. Frank didn't answer immediately. He was fishing in the oil with a magnetic pickup tool, the kind mechanics use to retrieve dropped bolts from impossible places. When he pulled it out, the magnet was covered with small metal fragments, shavings, really, ranging from the size of glitter to the size of rice grains. "That's bad," Sarah said quietly. "That's very bad," Frank agreed. He wiped the fragments onto a white cloth, spreading them out. In the harsh light of the work lamp, they glittered like malevolent stars. "This much metal in the oil means we've got parts grinding against each other somewhere. But look at the size distribution. These aren't all the same." He picked up a larger fragment with a pair of tweezers, holding it up to the light. "This piece is steel, probably from a gear tooth. But these smaller pieces," he indicated the glitter-like fragments, "these are bronze, bearing material." "The bearings are disintegrating," Pete said. "Some of them, yeah. But here's what bothers me." Frank sorted through the fragments carefully. "The sizes are too uniform. When bearings fail naturally, from age, from wear, from bad oil, you get all different sizes, random distribution. But these, look at them. It's like they were machined to be this size." Sarah frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't think this is natural wear. I think someone sabotaged this engine." The word hung in the air like a physical thing. Sabotage. It was the kind of accusation that ended careers, that triggered investigations, that turned simple mechanical failures into federal crimes. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said carefully. "Are you sure?" "No," Frank admitted, "but I'm sure enough to keep looking." He turned back to the oil sump, using a different tool now, a small brass spatula that wouldn't react with anything in the oil. He scraped along the bottom of the pan, collecting the sediment that had settled there, and that's when he found it. Mixed in with the metal fragments and the degraded oil was something that didn't belong, something that made Frank's blood run cold despite the warm night air in the hangar. "Get me a sample jar," he said quietly. "Glass, not plastic." Sarah hurried to comply. Frank carefully transferred a small amount of the sediment into the jar, then held it up to the light. In the clear glass, suspended in the dark oil, were tiny crystalline particles that caught the light like broken glass. "Silicon carbide," Frank said. "Grinding compound. Somebody put grinding compound in this engine's oil." Pete's face had gone pale. "But that would act like liquid sandpaper," Frank finished. "Every moving part in this engine, every bearing surface, every precision tolerance, all of it slowly being ground away. The engine would seem fine at first. All the measurements would check out. But hour by hour, flight by flight, it would be destroying itself from the inside." "Jesus Christ," Sarah breathed. "When we ran it up this morning, you accelerated the process. More RPM, more pressure, more oil flow, which meant more grinding compound getting into every critical space. The engine was probably already on the edge. Your test run pushed it over." Frank set down the jar and looked at both of them. "This wasn't your fault. Whoever did this, they did it before you ever touched this aircraft. Could have been the restoration shop in California. Could have been during transport. Could have been any time in the last few months." "But why?" Pete asked. "Who would sabotage a museum piece? It's not like there's money in it. It's not like someone's trying to kill anybody. The plane's not even airworthy yet." "Isn't it?" Frank said quietly. "Think about it. You were days away from certification, days away from putting this bird in the air with a pilot, maybe a crew, maybe passengers. What happens when an engine fails catastrophically at 2,000 feet? The implications settled over them like a shroud. This wasn't just vandalism or a malicious prank. This was attempted murder. Murder disguised as mechanical failure that would have been blamed on the age of the aircraft, on the difficulty of restoration, on bad luck. Never on the grinding compound that was slowly turning precision machinery into scrap metal. Sarah had her phone out. "I need to call Derek. We need to call the FAA, the FBI maybe. This is—" "Wait," Frank said. The word was soft but carried absolute authority. Sarah's finger hovered over the phone screen. "Wait for what? Mr. Morrison, if someone's trying to kill people, then we need to be smart about this. We start making calls, making accusations. This whole place becomes a crime scene. The investigation could take months. The Veterans Day ceremony gets cancelled. Those veterans, those men who served, who bled, who watched their friends die, they don't get to see this bird fly. The person who did this wins. So what do you suggest?" Sarah's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Frank looked at the partially disassembled engine, at the pile of contaminated parts, at the work that lay ahead. "We fix it. We rebuild this engine from the ground up, inspecting every single part. We document everything, photograph everything, save every piece of evidence, and we do it quietly." "That's insane," Pete said. "If there's someone out there trying to sabotage this project, then they think they've already succeeded. The engine seized. The project is dead. They're probably sleeping peacefully right now, thinking they've gotten away with it." Frank's eyes had gone hard, his jaw set in a way that reminded them he'd once been young and dangerous. "But we're not going to let them win. We're going to rebuild this engine better than it ever was. We're going to make it sing. And when that B-17 flies over the Veterans Day ceremony, when those old soldiers look up and see her in the sky, that's when whoever did this will know they failed. And then we turn over the evidence," Sarah said. "And then we turn over everything, every photograph, every contaminated part, every piece of documentation. We hand it to the authorities with a working engine and a flying aircraft, and we let them handle the investigation. But we do it on our terms, on our timeline. We don't let some saboteur dictate what happens to this project." Sarah looked at Pete. Pete looked at the engine. Finally, Sarah nodded slowly. "Okay, we do it your way. But Mr. Morrison, if anything else happens, anything that suggests someone's still actively trying to sabotage this project, we go to the authorities immediately." "Agreed." "Agreed," Frank said. They worked through the night in a silence broken only by the sounds of tools and occasional quiet instructions. Frank had them drain every drop of contaminated oil, bag and tag it for evidence. Every part that had been exposed to the grinding compound was removed, inspected under magnification, photographed and set aside. The damage was worse than Frank had initially thought. The compound had worked its way into nearly every lubricated surface in the engine. Bearings would need to be replaced. Cylinder walls would need to be honed and measured. The crankshaft itself, that massive, precision-machined heart of the engine, showed microscopic scoring that would need to be polished out. It was nearly 4 in the morning when Frank found something else. He was examining the engine's external oil filter housing, looking for additional evidence of contamination, when his fingers detected something that shouldn't be there. A roughness on the interior surface, almost imperceptible. He shone his flashlight inside and saw them, tiny drill marks. Someone had deliberately drilled microscopic holes in the filter housing, right at the seams where they'd be nearly impossible to detect. Oil would seep through those holes, slowly at first, then faster as the pressure of operation worked them wider. They wanted it to fail gradually, Frank said, showing Sarah and Pete his discovery. The grinding compound would weaken everything internally. The oil leak would mean decreasing lubrication. Eventually, catastrophically, the engine would destroy itself, and it would look like age, like bad maintenance, like the inevitable failure of old machinery. Whoever did this knew these engines. Pete observed. Knew exactly where to hit them to make the failure look natural. Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, they knew. A thought was forming in his mind, dark and unwelcome. Sarah, the restoration shop in California, the one that overhauled this engine in 2008. You have their records. Should be in the files. Why? I want to know who worked on this aircraft. Every mechanic, every inspector, every person who touched this engine, and I want to know if any of them had a connection to the B-17 program during the war. You think this is personal? Sarah asked. Someone with a grudge against the aircraft itself? I think someone wanted this bird to never fly again, and I think they were willing to kill to make that happen. That's not just professional sabotage. That's personal. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the hangar's high windows, Frank sat down heavily on a work stool. His body ached, his eyes burned with fatigue, and his hands trembled from hours of precise, demanding work. He was 82 years old, and he'd just worked through the night like he was 20 again. But unlike when he was 20, he didn't bounce back. The exhaustion settled into his bones like concrete. You should go home, Sarah said gently. Get some rest. We'll start fresh this afternoon. Frank shook his head. Can't. We've lost too much time already. We've got 9 days now until the ceremony. 9 days to rebuild an engine that's been deliberately sabotaged, to test it, to certify it, to make it airworthy. We can't afford rest. Mr. Morrison, Frank, you're going to kill yourself. Maybe, Frank agreed, but I've been dying slowly for 20 years, Sarah, ever since my wife passed, ever since I stopped mattering to anyone. This, he gestured at the engine, at the work spread out before them. This matters. Those veterans who are coming to see this bird fly, they matter. And I'll be damned if I let some coward with a drill and a bag of grinding compound take that away from them. He stood up, feeling his joints protest. Besides, I've got a score to settle now. Someone tried to use my bird, a B-17, a flying fortress, a machine that once stood between civilization and chaos. Someone tried to use her as a murder weapon. That's personal. That's desecration. And I don't let that stand. Pete was grinning despite the exhaustion on his face. You know what? I'm in. I'll call my wife, tell her she won't see me for a week. Let's rebuild this beast. Sarah hesitated, then smiled. All right, but we do this smart. We work in shifts. Nobody goes more than 16 hours without rest. We bring in Tommy and Jason, read them in on what we found, and we document everything. Everything, Frank agreed. Because when this is over, when that bird is in the air and those veterans are watching her fly, we're going to make sure whoever did this pays for it. As the other mechanics began to arrive for the day shift, Frank pulled out his old leather-bound notebook, the same one he'd carried during the war, its pages yellowed and brittle. He opened it to a blank page and began to write, his handwriting still precise despite his arthritis. He was documenting everything, yes, but he was also making a promise to the men who'd flown in these birds and never came home. A promise to the aircraft itself, this machine that had survived war and neglect and now sabotage. A promise that she would fly again. And Frank Morrison had never broken a promise to a flying fortress. Not in 1944, when keeping them flying meant life or death. And not now, when keeping this one flying meant honoring every man who'd ever trusted his life to these magnificent machines. The work began again, and this time everyone knew what they were fighting for. The morning of the Veterans Day ceremony arrived with a sky so clear and blue it looked like it had been painted specifically for the occasion. Frank Morrison stood in the hangar at 5 a.m., his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the B-17 that had consumed his every waking moment for the past 9 days. She was beautiful. The aluminum skin gleamed under the hangar lights, every panel perfectly aligned, every rivet properly set. The 4 Wright R-1820 engines sat in their nacelles like sleeping giants. The starboard inner, number 3, the one they'd rebuilt from scratch, looked identical to its siblings. No one would know the drama that had unfolded, the sabotage discovered, the desperate race against time. But Frank knew, and his scarred, aching hands knew. Couldn't sleep either? Derek Hastings approached, looking as exhausted as Frank felt. Over the past 9 days, Derek had transformed from dismissive facility director into something else. A partner, a believer. "Keep dreaming about missed bolts, forgotten steps," Frank admitted. "We've checked everything 3 times. It's perfect, Frank." "Nothing's perfect," Frank said quietly. "That's what worries me." Derek stood beside him in silence. "Veterans start arriving in 4 hours. FAA inspector in 2. The pilot's been studying maintenance logs since midnight. Everything's ready. And the evidence? Sealed and ready for the FBI after the ceremony. They're very interested." Frank nodded. They'd been meticulous. Every contaminated part, every drilled fitting, every fragment of silicon carbide documented. Sarah had traced the restoration shop in California, found a mechanic named Robert Chen, whose father had died in a B-17 over Germany in 1944. Chen had left under mysterious circumstances in 2009. "How are you feeling?" Derek asked. Frank considered carefully. Exhausted, anxious, old, but also something he hadn't felt in years. "Alive," he said finally. "I feel alive." The hangar filled around 8 a.m. Veterans first, men in their 80s and 90s, some in wheelchairs, some with walkers. All wore caps or jackets identifying their service. 8th Air Force, 381st Bomb Group, 100th Bomb Group, men who'd flown through hell and survived. Frank watched them approach the B-17 with expressions ranging from joy to overwhelming grief. Hands reached out to touch the aluminum skin with reverence. Eyes welled with tears. Voices cracked as old men told stories to younger family members who tried to understand but couldn't. Not really. "Frank Morrison?" The voice was reedy with age. Frank turned to find a man in a wheelchair, pushed by a middle-aged woman. The man wore a 381st Bomb Group cap. "Yes, sir." "Harold Wickham, waist gunner, 535th Squadron. Heard you were with the 381st at Ridgewell." Frank's throat tightened. "Yes, sir. Flight engineer and mechanic. 43 through 45. "Ridgewell." Harold's eyes lit up. "I was there 44 to 45. "Did you know James Fletcher? Flew Sweet Caroline?" "Jimmy Fletcher?" Frank's mind pulled up a memory decades old. "Yeah, good pilot. Careful. Brought his crew home." "He was my pilot," Harold said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "We took flak over Berlin that should have killed us, but Jimmy kept that bird flying. We crash-landed outside Cambridge, but all 10 of us walked away. Because of Jimmy." "Jimmy was one of the good ones. He died in 1987. Heart attack. Still miss him every day." Harold looked up at the B-17. "Haven't been this close to one since 1945. My daughter said I should come. I needed to remember. Needed to say goodbye to all the boys who didn't come home." Frank crouched down, his knees protesting. "Mr. Wickham, when this bird flies today, she flies for all of them. For Jimmy Fletcher and every pilot like him. For every crew that didn't make it. She flies because men like us believed these machines were worth saving, worth remembering." Harold gripped Frank's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you for keeping them flying. Then and now." The FAA inspector arrived at 9:30. Robert Chen. Frank's blood ran cold at the introduction. "Chen," Frank said carefully. "Any relation to Robert Chen from California Restoration?" "My older brother. Why?" "Small world in aviation." "Indeed." Chen's eyes were sharp. "Though my brother left the business years ago. Too many ghosts," he said. The words hung heavy. Derek tensed. Sarah's hand moved toward her phone, but Chen just smiled coldly and opened his checklist. "Shall we begin?" The inspection took 3 hours. Chen was obsessively thorough, checking everything, spending 45 minutes on the starboard inner engine alone. Frank watched for signs of guilt, recognition, anything. But Chen's face remained neutral. Finally, Chen signed the airworthiness certificate. "She's cleared. Engine work is exceptional. Best field repair I've seen." 70 years of practice, Frank said quietly. Chen looked at him long and hard. My father died in a B-17 over Regensburg, August 1943, ball turret gunner, 20 years old, direct flak hit, broke apart at 12,000 feet. No survivors. I didn't know. For years, I hated these machines. My brother too. That's why he left restoration. Couldn't reconcile honoring what killed our father. Chen paused. But I learned to separate the machine from the tragedy. These birds didn't kill anyone. They were tools used by brave men. My father knew the risks, chose to serve anyway. That's worth honoring, even though it hurts. Chen extended his hand again. Your work is excellent, Mr. Morrison. I hope this bird flies for another 70 years. My father would have wanted that. The ceremony began at noon. 300 people filled the area outside, veterans, families, officials, press. Derek gave the opening speech about preserving history. A congressman followed with hollow-sounding words about sacrifice. Then Derek called Frank to the platform. Frank hadn't prepared anything. He climbed the steps, his heart hammering, and stood at the microphone facing a sea of faces. His mind went blank. I'm not good with speeches, he said finally. Never have been. I'm a mechanic. I fix things. That's all I really know. He paused, searching for words. His eyes found Harold Wickham, found other veterans watching with patient understanding. 9 days ago, I walked into that hangar, and the people here looked at me like I was obsolete. Past my expiration date, too old for modern methods, modern technology, and maybe they were right. I am old. My hands shake. My eyes aren't what they were. I can't work 16 hours without paying for it. He let that sink in. But what I can do is listen, not just to people, but to machines. I can hear when an engine is sick, feel when metal is failing, smell problems sensors won't detect. That's not magic. That's 70 years of paying attention, of learning, of understanding that these machines are more than specifications on paper. His voice grew stronger. There's a belief today that new is always better, that experience can be replaced with education, that respect is demanded rather than earned. But some things can't be learned from books or screens. Some things require decades of mastery. And that knowledge, that bone-deep understanding, is what we lose when we decide age equals obsolescence. He gestured toward the hangar. That aircraft is 78 years old. By modern thinking, she should be behind velvet ropes, never flying. But she was built by people who understood that some things endure. Maintained by mechanics who knew excellence requires patience and precision. Flown by men who trusted their lives to craftsmen who took pride in their work. Frank looked at the young mechanics. These past 9 days, I worked with young people who could have dismissed me. But they listened. They learned. They trusted. Together, we rebuilt an engine someone had sabotaged. We did it because those men out there, he pointed at the veterans, deserve to see this bird fly, deserve to have their service honored, deserve to know their sacrifices still matter. His voice softened. I'm 82. I've buried my wife, my friends, my crew. Some mornings I wonder why I'm still here. But this week reminded me. I'm here to remember, to pass on knowledge that took a lifetime to acquire, to ensure sacrifices made by better men aren't forgotten. He stepped back, then leaned in once more. The young people here learned about old engines this week, but I hope they also learned about old people. We're not obsolete, we're not disposable. We're living libraries, and when you dismiss us, you're burning books you'll desperately wish you could read someday. Frank left the platform to thunderous applause. He saw Derek crying, Sarah grinning through tears, Harold Wickham saluting from his wheelchair, dozens of veterans doing the same. For the first time in 20 years, Frank felt like he mattered. Captain Jennifer Rodriguez, the pilot, had examined everything and declared herself confident. These old birds are tough, and this engine is better than factory fresh. At 12:45, they towed the B-17 onto the taxiway. The crowd followed. Frank stood with his crew, watching with pride and terror. She'll be fine, Sarah said tensely. "She has to be," Frank agreed. Rodriguez and her flight engineer completed their checks and climbed aboard. Then the port outer engine coughed to life. The sound hit Frank like a physical force, that deep, unmistakable roar of a Wright Cyclone. One by one the others fired. Port inner, starboard outer, then starboard inner. Number 3, his engine. It came to life perfectly. Propeller spinning smoothly, exhaust puffing properly, settling into a deep, rhythmic purr that spoke of precision and care. Frank listened with every fiber of his being, trained to detect the slightest problem. But there was nothing wrong. The engine sang perfectly, harmonizing with its siblings. "She sounds perfect," Pete breathed. "She sounds like 1944, Frank said, his voice breaking. Rodriguez ran up to full power, then began taxiing toward the runway. The crowd cheered. Veterans saluted. Some cried openly. Rodriguez reached the runway, turned into the wind, and stopped. Everything stilled, engines idling, propellers spinning lazily, the aircraft poised like a bird ready to fly. Then she pushed the throttles forward. 64,000 pounds of aircraft accelerated down the runway. Frank had witnessed thousands of takeoffs, but watching this one, this aircraft he'd saved, was almost more than his heart could bear. The wheels lifted. The B-17 climbed, banking slightly left, gaining altitude with steady, powerful grace. The sun glinted off polished aluminum, and she looked young again, vital and ready. The sound of 4 engines washed over them like a benediction. Harold Wickham sobbed openly. So did dozens of veterans. So did Derek and Sarah. So did Frank, tears streaming without shame. Rodriguez made 3 passes, low enough to see every detail, high enough to be safe. On the 3rd pass, she waggled the wings in salute, and the crowd erupted. Derek's hand found Frank's shoulder. "You did it." "We did it," Frank corrected. "All of us together." The B-17 landed smoothly and taxied back. When Rodriguez emerged, she was grinning. "She flies like a dream. Best B-17 I've ever piloted. Whoever worked on that engine is a master." Frank's chest swelled with pride he hadn't felt in decades. After everyone left, Frank stood alone with the B-17 in the sunset-lit hangar. He rested his hands on the starboard inner cowling, feeling residual heat. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for flying again." "Mr. Morrison?" A young man stood in the entrance. "I'm Robert Chen, the inspector's brother. He told me about the sabotage." Frank tensed. "I didn't do it," Chen said quickly. "But there was another mechanic at that shop, Martin Shaw. His grandfather was Luftwaffe, killed by a B-17. Shaw was obsessed, said these birds shouldn't be honored. Got fired in 2010 for falsifying records. I always wondered." Frank studied his face, saw only sincerity. "I spent years hating these machines for taking my father," Chen continued, "but watching her fly today, seeing those veterans, I finally understood. My father died serving something bigger. That's worth honoring, even though it hurts." They shook hands. "I'm grateful you saved her. My father would be too." That evening, Frank sat with good whiskey and opened his old notebook to write, November 11th, 2025. B-17G, Memphis Bell Jr., returned to flight status. Aircraft performed flawlessly. Mission accomplished. Worked with exceptional young people who listened and learned. Maybe the knowledge won't die with my generation after all. I'm exhausted, but it's a good tired. The kind that comes from important work, from keeping promises, from honoring the dead by keeping their memory alive in aluminum and steel. That's all any of us can ask for. To be remembered, to matter, to know our work made a difference. Frank raised his glass in silent toast. To the men who didn't come home, to the young mechanics who trusted him, to everyone who understood some things are worth preserving. 3 weeks later, the FBI arrested Martin Shaw in Oregon. Evidence matched the sabotage. He'd confessed to targeting multiple restoration projects, driven by twisted revenge. Sarah was promoted to Director of Restoration Operations. Her first act, establishing a mentorship program pairing young mechanics with experienced veterans, the Legacy Program. Frank accepted their invitation to teach, to share 70 years of knowledge, to ensure his skills wouldn't disappear with his generation. On his first day, standing before 10 young mechanics, Frank opened his notebook and began simply, "Before we discuss engines or specifications, we need to talk about respect. Respect for the craft, respect for the machines, respect for those who came before. Because everything we do standing on the shoulders of giants, and it's time we started acting like we know that." The young mechanics leaned forward, listening, and Frank Morrison, 82 years old and finely valued, began to teach, began to pass on knowledge earned over a lifetime, began to ensure that wisdom doesn't expire, and experience isn't obsolete just because it comes with grey hair and weathered hands. The lesson had been learned, and Frank was going to make sure it was never forgotten. If this story touched your heart, share it. Drop a comment about someone older who surprised you with their wisdom. Tell us about a time you learned something valuable from someone you'd initially underestimated. Subscribe for more stories honoring unsung heroes, the mechanics, veterans, and elders who carry history in their hands and hard-earned wisdom in their hearts. Their stories deserve to be told.